Hey everyone! Tonight we are going to explore a tale of unyielding courage and resilience as we follow a young boy thrust into the unforgiving embrace of the wilderness, confronting fear far beyond his years. Picture the dense forest at dawn, shafts of golden light cutting through ancient pines, birdsong weaving an age-old symphony, and the crisp, pine-tinged air filling your lungs with promise. Our story centers on Eli, a bright 10-year-old whose wide-eyed wonder at nature's beauty is about to be put to the ultimate test. In just moments, the familiar warmth of family will vanish and the forest's shadows will close in around him. As you listen, imagine your own heartbeat racing, every snap of a twig echoing like a warning. So before we get started, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel so I can keep making better videos. Now enjoy a cup of hot tea and let's embark on this journey together tonight. The morning had begun like any other family adventure. Eli's small hand was snug in his mother's as they set off along the winding trail, his father trailing behind with a loaded backpack and his little sister chatting about spotting deer. The path was well worn, lined with familiar wooden signs painted in cheerful green arrows. Every milestone, the crooked birch at the fork, the moss-covered boulder where they paused for snacks, felt as comforting as an old friend. Sunlight danced across Eli's brown curls as he skipped ahead, backpack humming with the soft thud of granola bars and extra socks. By midday, the family had paused near a shallow stream to rest. Eli perched on a rock, his legs dangling over the gurgling water, crunching an apple and marveling at darting minnows. His mother laid out sandwiches on a blanket, and his sister rummaged for crayons to draw the scene. The air was warm, laughter echoed between the trees. Eli's eyelids grew heavy. The steady drone of his father's voice faded as he drifted into a light nap under a canopy of swaying leaves. When he woke, the forest felt different. For a moment, the silence wrapped around him like a blanket, and his heart fluttered in confusion. His lips tasted like the last bite of apple, and his backpack lay neatly at his feet. But the voices, the laughter, the gentle chatter of his family had gone. Eli sat up, scanning the tight ring of trees. The sun had edged lower in the sky, but there was no sign of the familiar picnic spot. He blinked, unsettled. Had he rolled down the embankment? No, that would have been higher, rockier. Eli rose on shaky legs, clutching his backpack strap as though it might anchor him to safety. He called out softly, "Mom, Dad, Sarah." His voice quavered, swallowed by the hush of the woods. Only the distant call of a jay answered. Panic pricked the back of his neck. He hurried to the last place he remembered his family, the blanket now gone, leaving no trace of crumbs or sandwich crusts, as if it had never existed. His pulse pounded as he stumbled along the trail seeking those encouraging green arrows. Instead, he found blank posts with fresh nails where signs should have been. The arrows that once pointed the way to the brook, the meadow, the ridge had been stripped away, leaving only the pale wood. Eli's breath caught. His throat tightened as the truth sank in the markers. The assurances that he was on a known path were gone. He ran his trembling fingers over the splintered wood, searching for any carved remnants of direction. Why would someone remove them? A trickster? A prank? No adult would dare on a day like today. He spun, eyes darting through the undergrowth, looking for footprints, anything human. The soft earth yielded only his own small prints, leading back into the empty forest that felt suddenly vast and hostile. A hollow ache blossomed in his chest. He sank to one knee, packing and unpacking his bag, without thinking, trying to steady himself. The last swinging signpost reminded him of those treasure hunt games he played with his sister, where X really did mark the spot. But here, there was no treasure map, just emptiness. Night would come soon. Shadows would lengthen. How would he find water fire help? Tears blurred his vision, but he forced them back. Panic would freeze him. Fear must be rationed as carefully as his granola bars. He inhaled deeply, tasting the sweet, earthy scent of pine needles. The wood had been his playground, his fortress. Now it felt like a maze. But even a maze had edges, and edges could be found. He rose, wrenching himself free of the terror knotted in his stomach. He would look for the broken trail, retrace his steps. He would follow the sun's arc or the moss on the trees. He would not wait. Above all, he would not collapse. For a 10-year-old alone, hope was his first survival tool. With a final glance at the signpost's gaping frame, Eli slung his backpack over one shoulder and stepped forward into the unknown depths of the forest, every rustle and bird call a question. He kept moving because stillness meant defeat. One step, and then another, the boy's small figure swallowed by the towering trunks. And so began the day when the world he knew vanished, leaving only the wild and his own fierce will to find a way back. Eli's feet trembled as he swallowed the last of his fear, his chest heaving with shallow breaths. The forest around him seemed both familiar and treacherous, its every whisper magnified by the pounding of his heart. He paused, pressing his hand to a tree trunk slick with moss to steady himself. He closed his eyes and breathed in the damp evergreen scent, willing his racing thoughts to settle. In that moment of forced calm, he remembered his father's steady voice. Keep your eyes on landmarks, Eli. Nature always leaves a trail if you know how to look. Opening his eyes, he scanned the underbrush for anything that could guide him back: the crooked birch, the mossy boulder, the jagged rock where his sister had sketched birds. But the birch, tall and ghost white, stood farther off than he remembered, and the boulder, thick with velvety moss, was hidden beneath fallen branches. The landscape had shifted in his mind overnight, as if the forest had quietly rearranged itself. He felt a fresh swell of dread, but clenched his jaw. Panic might cloud his senses. He needed focus. Slowly he knelt and retrieved a crumpled piece of wax paper from his backpack, the one he'd used to wrap an extra granola bar. He flattened it on his palm, its waxy surface catching the dappled light. In that simple rectangle, he found a strategy record his path. He tore off a thin strip of bark from the tree, careful not to damage its life. With the corner of his shirt sleeve, he dabbed a bit of charcoal from a burned twig and sketched a small arrow on the bark. Its direction pointed back toward where he believed the trail had been. He tucked the marker into a side pocket, promising himself He would follow them in reverse if he needed to. Eli stood and brushed at his knees, the damp earth seeping through his pants. His spine stiffened as he forced himself past the point of breakdown. He forced a step forward, then another, keeping his gaze on the ground for footprints his own or anyone else's. But all he found were deer tracks and the occasional squirrel's imprint, evidence of wildlife, but no human presence. Even the ground seemed to mock him by giving no answers. He rose, eyes lifting to the treetops, where patches of sky flickered like broken glass. He needed to find orientation, north-south, anything. His mother had taught him that moss often grows thicker on the north side of trees. He remembered her words clearly. It's not foolproof, but it can help when you're really lost. Running a hand along a nearby trunk, he felt the moss more plush on one side. He turned until he believed he faced south, then took a deep breath and picked a direction to follow. At first, his steps were cautious, each snap of a twig sounding like an alarm. But as minutes ticked into an hour, his muscles loosened into a steady rhythm. He counted in his head, matching each footfall to a silent mantra: breathe step, breathe step. The forest floor, strewn with pine needles and upturned roots, demanded his full attention. Every slip could twist an ankle. Every misstep could send him tumbling into hidden hollows. He watched each placement as if his very life depended on it, which in truth it did. The sun drifted lower, unveiling pockets of golden light that danced across the forest floor. As he walked, memories of the morning crept into his mind, his sister's laughter echoing as they played Follow the Leader, their family's warm embrace by the stream, the taste of his mother's famous peanut butter sandwich. These memories brought both comfort and longing, a bittersweet ache that tightened the lump in his throat. He blinked back tears, reminding himself that sadness would slow him down. Instead, he used the memories as fuel. He would survive for them. His family was out there somewhere, and he had to find them. A gust of wind rattled the branches overhead, dislodging a cascade of rusty leaves. Eli ducked instinctively, the sound jolting him back to the present. He tucked his hair behind his ear and checked his backpack, counting the rations, still left 2 sips of water in his bottle, half a granola bar, the piece of wax paper, a flimsy poncho, and a small pocket knife. He pressed a finger to his lips, hushing the hollow growl in his stomach. He couldn't waste energy on hunger. He would ration until he found water. Suddenly, a flash of color caught his eye, a fragment of red fabric tangled in a low branch. He froze and crept closer, his heart thumping so hard he worried it might give him away. The fabric was familiar. It looked like the corner of his mother's kerchief, the one she always tied around her wrist. He reached out, fingertips brushing the soft cotton. It seemed impossibly improbable. His mind raced with hope. She must have passed here and snagged it. Maybe she knew he was missing and had retraced her own steps. He tugged the kerchief free and wrapped it around his wrist, the familiar scent of lavender and citrus grounding him. A surge of relief warmed his chest, fighting back the creeping cold of anxiety. With renewed determination, he adjusted his pack, pressed his shoulder blades together, and set off again this time, following the path he believed his mother had taken. Each step felt more confident, as if the kerchief itself were guiding him. As the sky shifted from bright blue to dusky rose, Eli spotted what looked like a small path, a faint indentation where others had trodden. He paused at its edge, torn between relief and suspicion. Could it really be the right way? Fear whispered that it might lead him deeper into the unknown. But hope nudged harder. Someone had been here, and that someone had a family that mattered. He exhaled and chose trust over doubt. His legs carried him along the narrow way, each bend revealing new patterns of light and shadow. Birds flitted overhead, and somewhere an unseen creek chuckled in the distance. He followed the sound, gripping the knife's handle through his shirt pocket. He hummed a tune his sister loved, the one they'd sung together at bedtime softly in his mind to soothe his nerves. The melody wove through the trees, a reminder of home. Then, just as his confidence peaked, the path vanished. He froze hard in his throat, surrounded again by unbroken undergrowth. The faint trail ended abruptly, leaving him more disoriented than ever. The kerchief on his wrist felt heavy, its promise unfulfilled. He pressed his fingers against it, tears stinging his eyes. A crushing doubt settled in his chest. What if he'd followed the wrong indicator? What if no one had passed by at all? For a moment, Eli stood rooted to the spot, the forest's hush closing in. Then he remembered his father's words again. When you feel lost, stop, breathe, and look for what you do know. He closed his eyes, letting the sounds of the forest wash over him, the rhythmic drip of sap, the distant rustle of fur in the leaves. He pictured the sun's position in the sky, its downward tilt confirming westward. He pictured the river they'd crossed in the morning, its current shimmering in his memory. In his mind's eye, he retraced each twist and turn, mapping them one by one. Opening his eyes, clarity dawned. He would head toward the sound of running water, confident that the stream by their picnic spot would lead him back to the family. It might be farther than he wanted, but it was a starting point. With that decision solidified, fear loosened its grip on him. He squared his shoulders, his resolve hardening into something steely and unbreakable. As he resumed his journey, the forest seemed to acknowledge his determination. A breeze lifted the kerchief on his wrist, and the fading light painted the leaves in autumnal golds despite the spring season. Every step forward felt like a small victory against the void of uncertainty. Eli proceeded quietly, every sense alert, his mind attuned to the smallest hints of guidance. In the interplay of shadow and light, he was remapping the world, turning fear into purpose, one breath at a time. A low rumble in Eli's belly reminded him time was slipping away, each pang a countdown echoing in his mind. He paused beside a cluster of ferns, whose damp fronds brushed his knees and sank to his haunches, sliding open his backpack with trembling fingers. The contents glinted in the fading light: a half-empty water bottle, 2 granola bar fragments wrapped in wax paper, a solitary apple core from the morning's snack, a flimsy silver poncho, a small pocket knife, and a crumpled map, useless now without trail markers. His pulse tightened as he surveyed his dwindling resources. Hunger and thirst loomed larger than fear now, and he steeled himself against both. He set the map aside and drew out the granola bars, their sugary aroma somehow more tantalizing than the smell of pine. He unfolded one piece of wax paper, peeled back its edges, and regarded the broken bar as though it were a rare jewel. Licking his lips, he snapped off a small corner no larger than his thumbnail and let the sweet crumbs dissolve slowly on his tongue. Closing his eyes, he savored every grain of oats and fleck of honey, feeling warmth seep into his chest. Then he placed the bar back into its paper sleeve and tucked it into the side pocket of his pack. He repeated the process with the second fragment, dividing each into 3 pinhead-sized bites that he would eat one at a time. This ritual gave him a sense of control of order in a world that seemed determined to spiral into chaos. Next, he unscrewed the water bottle's cap and held it to his lips, minding every drop. He set a rule: 3 sips at the top of every hour, no more. He practiced that measured sip once, twice, building the rhythm of his own rationing clock. With this plan, he could make his resources last long enough to find the stream he'd been following in his mind. It was an austere bargain, but necessity demanded discipline. The apple core he wrapped in the poncho, for now hoping to eat its fleshy remains later when hunger gnawed too fiercely. He understood that delaying gratification could be his lifeline. His stomach protested, sending another tremor through his limbs, but he quelled the sensation by straightening his back and staring into the gathering shadows. The forest's chill would punish him for idleness. Movement burned calories. Energy expended to traverse the wood would stave off hunger's worst effects. He would use every step as a shield against the gnawing inside him. He tightened the straps of his backpack, letting its weight press against his shoulders in a steady, reassuring way. Each thump of the pack felt like the steady heartbeat of his resolve. He rose and tested the knife in his hand, flexing his fingers around its handle. The blade was dull, but capable of cutting through thin vines or slicing fruit if he found more. It could also fashion crude fishing hooks if he reached water teeming with minnows or small fish. The moment of grim planning over, he set off downhill, the slope gentle but filled with hidden roots that snagged his boots. He placed each foot, deliberately counting off with a silent mantra, 1 step, 2 step. The dull ache of his stomach soon receded into the background as his mind occupied itself with the mechanical task of walking. As he descended, the sounds of the forest deepened the drip of evaporating moisture from the poncho, the distant whistle of wind through the canopy, and the abrupt cry of a hawk overhead. Hunger became another texture in the forest's tapestry, something to notice, but not to drown in. In his mind, he replayed the morning's rationing exercise, calculating how long his leftovers might sustain him. At 3 sips per hour, his half-full bottle could last nearly 12 hours. At 3 tiny bites per hour, his granola bar pieces could stretch across a day of ticking hours. The apple saved for a later struggle would be the grand finale. This newfound arithmetic gave him purpose survival measured in sips and bites, each a milestone marking progress. Time would become an ally rather than an enemy as long as he adhered to the plan. He rounded a bend and spotted a patch of wild berries, a cluster of bright red fruits haloed by dew. His heart leaped. He crouched, examining them closely. They resembled the raspberries his grandmother grew in her backyard. But he knew appearances could betray. Some berries were poisonous, their colors a warning. He recalled her warning, "If you're not sure, leave them on the bush." His hand hovered torn between the desperate urge to taste something fresh and the voice of caution. Survival depended on both courage and restraint. Today, he chose restraint. He rose, closing his fingers around the knife's handle, not the berries. They would stay on their stems. As he walked, he murmured the rationing rules to himself: 3 sips at the top of the hour, 3 bites at the bottom. He checked his watch, a gift from his father, on his wrist. The minute hand pointed to a weathered 4, though he wasn't sure if it still kept perfect time. Regardless, he trusted the semblance of structure. He set a mental timer. When the minute hand hit the next quarter, he'd take his next measured sip. Until then, he would focus on thigh muscles pressing against his shirt arms, swinging, and eyes scanning for anything that could aid his journey. The sky dimmed into purples and grays, and a chill seeped through the trees as evening crept closer. Eli hunched his shoulders against the cold, grateful for the poncho he'd saved for moments like this. He unfurled it, wrapping it around his tapered frame. The plastic crackled softly, a small comfort that kept the damp at bay. His breath rose in misty puffs, another reminder that night would bring colder tests. He tucked the apple core into the poncho's pocket for later and pressed on. A set of pale footprints in the soil caught his eye, small like his own, but heading in the opposite direction. His heart thumped. Could it be someone else, or was it his own, from an earlier loop through the woods? The ambiguity tormented him. He kneeled, tracing the print with a finger. The depth suggested a heavier weight, possibly an adult. He rose, hope igniting his chest. Maybe his father was searching, but then he realized the prints meandered without direction, as if unaware of their purpose. They crisscrossed, doubled back, and led into dense underbrush. A prank, a dream. He swallowed a sip of water and inhaled, calming the tempest of hope and doubt. Night would be on them within the hour. He needed a plan for shelter fire and warmth. But first, he honored his rationing. He paused on a small clearing, knelt, and at the precise moment when the minute hand pointed eastward in his mind, took 3 small sips of water. Then, when the imagined minute hand struck south, he took 3 pinhead bites of granola. He counted slowly, reverently, as if performing a ritual older than time. Each swallow and chew became a vow: I will not surrender. His hunger receded again, transformed into a cold buzz that sharpened his senses. The rationed intake became fuel, and he felt a surge of clarity. His feet fell into a steady pattern, his gaze clear and alert. The forest floor, bathed in dusk, revealed faint animal tracks: raccoon, fox, perhaps deer. He pressed his ear to the ground and heard the subtle thud of his own heartbeat syncing with the world around him. Eli stood and brushed off his knees. He had survived hunger long before. This was another test of will. With a final glance at the berries left untouched and the footprints left unchased, he slung his pack onto his shoulders and resumed his journey down a slope that slid toward the promise of water, companionship, and eventually home. In the deepening twilight, the discipline of his rationing plan illuminated his path like a lantern, each sip and bite a beacon guiding him through the wild. The sky above Eli had dimmed to a bruise-colored twilight by the time he spotted a cluster of fallen pines leaning against a stout oak. His teeth chattered lightly, the cold seeping through his poncho and settling in his bones. He knew that without a proper shelter, hypothermia could overtake him long before dawn. The rations in his pack might keep his strength for a little while longer, but warmth would become his most precious commodity as night descended. He inhaled deeply, tasting the resinous tang of pine, and steeled himself. He needed to build a lean-to, and quickly. Dropping his pack, Eli surveyed the makeshift nook formed by the fallen trunks. The oak's broad branches offered a sturdy backbone, and the pines had shed many of their needles, leaving a skeleton of limbs that he could reinforce. He knelt, pulling a handful of dry leaves and small twigs from under his coat pocket, the scrapings of survival he'd gathered earlier. With his pocket knife, he sliced at thin saplings, whittling 2 straight poles about as long as his arm. His breath formed small clouds in front of him, and he worked with shaking fingers, each movement precise, despite the cold. He placed one pole at the base of the oak, angling it toward the ground at roughly a 45-degree slope. He repeated this with the second pole a hip width away, creating a simple A-frame against which he could lean crossbeams. Then he scoured the ground for stout sticks to serve as rafters, each about as thick as his wrist. Wincing as the frosty soil bit into his palms, he managed to haul 6 into place, wedging them securely between the sapling poles and the oak trunk. The framework stood shaky, but promising, like the first ribs of a newborn structure. Next came insulation. Eli used his knife to strip bark from a nearby birch, curling the thin sheets into rough thatch he tucked between the rafters. He layered sprays of evergreen branches, needles facing outward to repel rain, and pressed handfuls of dry leaves into every nook. The shelter grew snug and dense under his careful hands. Finally, he draped the silver poncho over the roof, anchoring it with heavy stones he found nearby. Its crinkling surface reflected the last of the evening light, making the lean-to look like a tiny, battered ship beached on a forest floor. He sat back on his heels and studied his work. The shelter appeared small, just large enough for his curled-up frame, but the walls seemed tight and sturdy. He tested the lean-to's reach by pressing the flat of his hand against the poncho. It held firm. A gust of wind rustled through the trees, and Eli felt the shelter sway slightly under the onslaught. His heart skipped a beat, but the structure held. He exhaled a thin ribbon of relief, slipping free. Still, he knew that midday winds were nothing compared to the chill that nighttime could bring. He worked again, filling gaps with stray tufts of moss and loose pine needles. His fingertips grew numb, but he refused to quit. Each fistful of insulation was a barrier against the forest's merciless cold. He imagined each pine needle as a warrior, stiff, unyielding, protecting him from the elements. He shoveled more branches into place until his arms ached and his lungs burned. At last he crawled inside backpack, still slung on his shoulders, to serve as a pillow. The interior felt narrow, but surprisingly dry. He tested its depth by stretching his legs forward. His boots brushed the far edge, leaving just enough room to lay flat. The air inside was tempered, shielded from the wind's bite, and the poncho's inner surface caught stray warmth from his body. He closed his eyes, listening to the muffled sounds of the forest, the creak of branches, the whisper of leaves, and a distant owl's hoot. The shelter had transformed a savage wood into something almost hospitable. A pang of loneliness struck him as he huddled in the dim space. He thought of his sister's soft sighs when she nestled under blankets of his father's deep, even breathing beside him in a tent of his mother's humming lullaby. Here, the forest hummed its own nocturne one that he couldn't quite decipher. Memories brought comfort and ache in equal measure. They reminded him why he must endure, but also how much he missed the warmth of family. He rubbed his arms as if trying to hug himself, then closed his eyes and forced his teeth to stop chattering. Fumbling in his pocket, he retrieved the wax paper-wrapped granola bar, though he had rationed it for daylight hours. He paused, considering the trade-off between immediate energy and future endurance. Night would sap his strength more quickly than hunger now. He broke off a tiny piece no more than 2 quick bites and let each crumb dissolve on his tongue. Sweetness sparked a faint warmth in his belly that radiated outward, bolstering his resolve. Then he stowed the remainder back out of sight. Eli's gaze drifted upward to where a sliver of sky peeked through the gap between the poncho and the oak. He watched the first stars blink into existence, each a cold point of light that felt both distant and strangely comforting. The lean-to held, but he needed to ensure it would endure the long night. He paused, listening for signs of rain. The last time he camped with his family, raindrops had pounded their tent so hard it felt like tiny hammers. If it rained now, water could seep through the bark and leaves, soaking him into numbness. He shivered at the memory. Using his knife, he carved a small trench around the lean-to's front, angling it to divert any trickle of water away from his shelter. He kicked the disturbed earth to compact it, then pressed rocks along the trench's lip. It was a crude moat, but one he hoped would give his lean-to a fighting chance against rainwater. He stood and raised his arms, examining the poncho's slope. Everything looked secure. He'd done all he could. Still, the forest held unpredictable dangers. A sudden gust rattled loose a half-rotten branch overhead, sending it crashing onto the lean-to's roof. Eli's heart hammered as he lay flat, the crash vibrating through the poncho's skin. He held his breath until the echoes subsided, then exhaled in a rush. The structure had withstood the blow, though the fallen branch lay draped awkwardly across the poncho, denting the roof's curve. He reached out, careful not to startle any hidden insects, and removed it, tossing it aside. His shelter trembled once more under another gust, but stood firm. Inside the lean-to, he felt a tender pride swell within him. He had transformed raw wood and foliage into a fortress, an achievement that warmed him more than any fire could have. Yet he still lacked a flame. Frigid darkness would descend, and without heat, he risked frostbite. He considered his options, sparking a fire from stones and flint, But he had no flint. Friction methods would demand steady hands and dry materials likely beyond his cold fingers. He fingered the pocket knife, wishing for a lighter or matches he did not have. He hoped tomorrow would bring warmer conditions and perhaps a chance to scavenge for tools. He settled back into the lean-to, winding the poncho around his legs. He hugged his knees to his chest, burrowing into the pine needle bed that lined the floor. The world outside darkened. Shadows formed shapes that teased at his imagination, branches that might be reaching hands, rustles that might be creeping animals. He pressed his back against the sturdy oak trunk, feeling its ancient strength, and let its solidity calm him. Night deepened, and the forest's orchestra intensified the low croak of frogs. From somewhere unseen, the distant howl of a coyote and the rustling of small creatures hunting for their own supper. Eli kept his eyes fixed on the lean-to's entrance, envisioning dawn's first light as a white bar against the black. If he slept even a short nap, he might regain the energy to continue. But sleep meant vulnerability. He decided on minutes rather than hours, short rests, punctuated by checks of the surroundings. He pulled the kerchief from his wrist and pressed it to his face, drawing in its lavender citrus scent. A small act, but it grounded him a bridge back to his mother's warmth. Slowly, he lay down, eyes half open, counting his breaths. Each inhale brought the scent of lavender. Each exhale released a bit of the day's fear. He felt the chill pierce him whenever he exhaled, and each time he tucked tighter into the poncho's folds. Minutes passed in measured silence until his eyelids drooped fully and exhaustion claimed him. His body curled instinctively against the ground's uneven contours. The lean-to's walls groaned with the wind, yet each sound reminded him he was protected. He slipped into a light sleep, dreams of his family blurring with images of falling stars and protective trees. Outside, the wind sighed. Inside, Eli clung to his small victories, the bars he'd rationed, the shelter he'd built, the trench he'd carved. In the fragile cocoon of his lean-to, a 10-year-old's bravery had turned the wild's indifference into a fragile haven. And in the darkest hour before dawn, he would wake again to face whatever came next. Morning light filtered through the lean-to's narrow entrance, painting the interior in pale gold. Eli stirred, shivering, as he peeled himself free of the poncho's cocoon. His limbs protested, stiff and sore, a dull ache that spoke of cold and tension. With careful movements, he pushed himself up and rested against the oak trunk, drawing in the familiar scent of pine and damp earth. The world outside whispered it was time to find water. He slid from the shelter and knelt at the trench's edge, peering down its length. Tiny rivulets of dew melt trickled through, confirming his drain idea had worked. Encouraged, he rose and stretched muscles, popping faintly in protest. He gathered his supplies, knife remaining granola fragments, water bottle, and tied the kerchief tight around his hair to keep sweat and hair out of his face. The forest felt quieter in the dawn chill, the treetops stirring only in slow, thoughtful creaks. Following his plan, he headed west, trusting the sun's low arc. His feet left light impressions in the soft earth, occasional droplets of morning dew cooling his socks through his boots. He hummed his sister's favorite tune softly, the melody weaving comfort through his solitude. He listened for the sound of running water, an undercurrent of promise amid the hush of pines. Pressing through a narrow corridor of ferns, Eli spotted damp soil leading toward a cluster of beech trees. He crouched, brushing aside leaf litter, to reveal a wet patch that glimmered like dark glass. His heart leapt. Water must be near. He traced the moisture upward and followed it until he came upon a thin, sunken gully where rainwater had carved a shallow path. No gushing stream yet, but the ground's telltale wetness suggested a source. He crouched to touch the cool earth, confirming it felt moist beneath his fingertips. Standing, he examined the gully's slope and direction it ran toward a dip in the landscape. He guessed that if he followed it downhill, it might widen into a creek. With renewed hope, he set off along the gully, stepping carefully to keep his weight balanced on high points. The forest shifted around him. Tree species changed ground cover, shifted signs that he was moving through different ecological zones. Each new plant whispered clues. Moss-laden stones hinted at hidden springs. Wet leaves and shallow puddles marked the flow's undercurrent. A low swirl of mist hovered above a hollow ahead. Eli paused, squinting as he approached. The mist danced over the ground, betraying the presence of water even before he heard its gentle murmur. He pressed onward, breaking through a thicket of brambles into a small clearing. There, nestled between ferns and rock outcroppings, lay a narrow, winding creek. Its water was clear and cold, tumbling over smooth stones with a soft, welcoming gurgle. Eli's chest tightened with relief and triumph. He knelt at the creek's edge, filling his bottle with the fresh flow. The liquid sloshed with a crisp sound that made his mouth water. He held the bottle to his lips and drank deeply, no rationing now, just pure, unreserved refreshment. Coolness flooded his throat and belly, chasing away the hollow ache of thirst. He splashed water onto his face and arms, the cold shock sharpening his senses. After refilling, he paused to observe his surroundings. Dragonflies hovered above the surface, their wings flashing in the light. Moss-haired stones glowed chartreuse where the sun struck them, and ferns bowed to taste the mist. The creek's banks rose gently, lined with smooth pebbles and shady overhangs. He noted the terrain in his mind, storing this oasis in his mental map. If he needed to retrace his steps or lead rescuers to him, he could describe these features. Yet water alone could not sustain him indefinitely. He needed to find a way to carry more or locate additional sources. He scanned upstream, spotting a wider bend where the creek might pool. He also noticed a cluster of hollow logs nearby, potential makeshift reservoirs if he could block part of the flow. Tucking these ideas away, he finished filling his bottle and screwed the cap firmly on, careful to avoid spills. The weight of fresh water in his pack felt reassuring, a lifeline secured. Standing, he realized his pants were damp from kneeling. He lifted one leg and shook it, scattering water droplets into the air. The cool breeze drew gooseflesh across his skin, reminding him that warmth remained an urgent need. But water was the first critical conquest. Now he had breathing room to plan his next moves. He scouted the creek's perimeter, searching for signs of wildlife. Fresh deer tracks led along the bank, and rabbit droppings dotted the leaf litter. These clues told him that the creek was a hub of activity, a place where animals came to drink. Potentially, he could observe animals' patterns to find food sources later. But for now, he needed to return to his lean-to before the sun climbed too high and the forest's midday heat clouded his path. He sat atop a flat stone, took out the remaining 2 small granola bites, and savored them with clean water. Each chew reminded him how far he'd come since leaving his family's picnic spot. The rhythm of drinking and eating here felt like a ritual of renewal, a break in his solitary ordeal that recharged both body and spirit. He leaned back against the stone, facing upstream, eyes closed, as he counted his remaining supplies and mapped out his next steps. Memory flickered his father's confident stroke as he pointed downstream to show how to navigate currents safely. His mother's advice on boiling water before drinking, though he lacked the means to boil. His sister's giggle when she pretended to be a mermaid in the stream. Those recollections warmed him. They reminded him that survival was a family affair, and though he was alone now, he carried their voices within him. Finishing his granola, he drank once more from the creek, leaving only a faint ripple. He stowed the bottle securely in his pack and stood flexing his fingers around the knife's handle as though greeting an old friend. He scanned the creek one last time, imprinting its twists and stones on his mind like coordinates in a secret guidebook. Then, patting the stone gratefully, he turned and began retracing his steps toward the lean-to. As he followed the gully back through the forest, each footfall crunched softly on damp leaves. He felt lighter, his pack heavier with water, but his spirit buoyant. The forest's murmurs now felt like conversations, each rustle, call, and drip, telling him he was no longer merely lost, but also learning how to belong. He hummed again, this time a hopeful refrain that echoed off the trees. By the time he spotted the familiar slope leading up to his shelter, the sun had risen higher, casting mottled shadows across the ground. Eli quickened his pace, eager to secure his newfound resource and plan for the day ahead. The lean-to emerged from the trees like a silent sentinel, and he hurried toward it, water in hand, hope renewed for whatever challenges lay ahead. Eli approached the lean-to with careful steps, each footfall steady, despite the extra weight of his water-filled bottle. He dropped his pack beside the entrance and paused, surveying the grove's quiet hush. The morning's triumph securing water had invigorated him, but the forest's dusky sense of isolation remained. He opened his pack, set the water beside his granola stash, and ran a finger over the carved bark arrow he'd tucked inside. It was still legible, a tiny guarantee in an unpredictable world. He patted it and swung his shirt sleeve across his brow, wiping away the sheen of exertion. He glanced about, deciding it was time to explore beyond the immediate area. The creek promised not only hydration, but perhaps clues to a safer route, or even edible plants. Today's goal: learn the forest's rhythms. He should know the land as well as he knew his own backyard. With that resolve, he slung the pack back on and stepped out, heading toward a cluster of birches where light pooled like molten silver on the forest floor. The undergrowth here was thinner and Eli's keen eyes caught movement at the edge of his vision. He froze mid-step, breath hitching. There, just beyond the birch trunks, a slender form nuzzled at a patch of ferns. He held perfectly still. The creature raised its head, a fox its coat, the color of autumn leaves, muzzle dusted in dew. For an instant, their gazes locked, amber eyes reflecting the boy's own awe. Eli's heart pounded, but his training in wildlife etiquette from weekend nature camps kicked in. He averted his gaze, slightly lowering his chin to avoid direct eye contact. The fox blinked and resumed its nibbling, its bushy tail flicking like a red banner against the green. Every muscle in its slim form rippled with quiet power and alertness. Eli felt a rush of exhilaration at being so near a wild creature. Then a spike of caution. Foxes could be unpredictable, and despite their reputation for shyness, they were still wild animals. He crouched lower, careful not to make sudden movements. He reached slowly into his pack for his sketchbook, the one his sister had insisted he bring, and flipped it open. His pencil hovered above the blank page. The fox's coat gleamed, each hair a brushstroke of russet white and charcoal, yet he hesitated. Any rustle might send it scattering. Instead, he watched, memorizing the graceful curve of its spine, the way its ears pivoted toward distant sounds. A sudden crack of wood behind him made him freeze like a statue. He dared not breathe as leaves rustled. The fox stiffened its ears, winging backward. It lowered its body and crept sideways, blending into the ferns. Eli's pulse, sharpened from awe to dread, was another animal or person approaching. He strained to listen. The rustle resolved into the deliberate steps of something larger, the soft padding of paws heavier than his own. A distant howl rose through the trees, chilling in its loneliness and primal force. The fox froze, then darted off, vanishing into the underbrush as its howls mingled with the woodland chorus. Eli's skin prickled. The haunting call reminded him he was not alone, but in a land ruled by instinct and unseen forces. He swallowed, fighting the urge to panic. The lean-to offered safety, but it also meant staying still, an invitation for curiosity or threat to draw near. He rose on unsteady legs, spine tingling. He clicked his tongue softly, a signal his father had taught him to use sparingly. No answer came, only another distant howl lower and more measured, a coyote, or perhaps a lone wolf, far enough away to be heard, but not to see. The sound carried a lesson. The wild watched, listened, and judged. Eli needed to respect its boundaries. With a cautious backward step, he turned toward the creek, intending to refill his bottle and observe from a less exposed vantage. Each twig he crushed underfoot sounded like a gunshot in the tense quiet. As he crept closer to the water's edge, his throat felt dry once more. He knelt and refilled the bottle, the rush of water soothing. Then, seated on a flat stone, he paused to reflect. The morning's encounter stirred conflicting emotions, wonder at the fox's beauty, and grace and fear prompted by howls in the distance. Both were essential lessons in the forest's schooling. He marveled at how life thrived here, how every creature from the tiniest insect to the largest mammal belonged to a delicate balance. But he also recognized that balance could tip swiftly toward danger. Eli opened his pack and retrieved his small pocket knife. He pressed its handle into the wooden rim of his water bottle, carving shallow notches on a scrap of bark. Each notch represented a lesson learned: scarcity shelter water, now wildlife. He would tally more lessons tomorrow. He replaced both in the pack, mindful of movement. He scanned the creek bank for animal tracks, noting the elongated prints of deer and tiny paw marks of raccoons. These creatures moved by routines, dawn and dusk patterns he could learn to predict. If he could time his travel or foraging to their habits, he might secure more resources. But he'd need to remain silent and invisible like the fox he'd glimpsed. A breeze stirred through the birches, setting silver leaves to quivering. Eli shivered, aware of the day's warmth fading. He needed to test his fledgling knowledge of foraging. But scent drifted on the wind, a sweet almond aroma that tugged at his memory. He inhaled deeply and followed it through a narrow passage of saplings. Underfoot, the ground rose slightly to form a shallow bank where a stand of wild almonds, or so his mother had taught him, bore clusters of small pod-like fruits. He knelt and plucked one of the pods, cracking it light with his knife. Inside, a smooth kernel peeked. He bit into it carefully. Its taste was mild and nutty. Not a feast, but safe. He filled a small corner of his pack with a handful, mindful of leaving most for the forest's creatures. This small harvest felt like a gift, and he placed a tiny thank you carving on a nearby stone, a habit he'd learned during a scouting trip. As he straightened, the distant howl echoed again, this time closer and more urgent. Eli's pulse leapt, and he snapped his head toward the sound. A line of low hills loomed beyond the creek, their ridges outlined against pale sky. The howl seemed to come from there, drifting down like a dirge. He plunged a hand into his pack for the kerchief and pressed it to his face. It smelled of lavender and sun, a reminder of home that soothed the edge of panic. He turned from the hills and back toward his lean-to, deciding additional daylight would be better spent preparing fire materials. But before he left, he allowed himself one longer look at the clearing where the fox had appeared. The spot felt charged, as if the woods themselves observed him. He remembered the fox's amber eyes brimming with curiosity and caution. Eli whispered a promise: "I'll learn your ways, but I won't become prey." The forest seemed to exhale, and he felt the weight of a pact sealed in silence. With the wild's dual gift, beauty and warning, etched in his mind, he set off along the creek bank, every sense attuned, ready for whatever the woods would teach him next. Eli stepped back from the creek's edge, his mind buzzing with possibilities. The forest offered more than just water and wild almonds. It contained raw materials waiting for transformation. He paused on a mossy rock, feet damp from his brief kneeling, and surveyed the woodland surrounds. Branches lay strewn like fallen arrows, stones glinted half buried in leaf litter, and vines curled around saplings like lazy serpents. Today, he decided these ordinary objects would become tools, extensions of his will to survive. His first task was self-defense. In his backpack lay the pocket knife, useful but limited to close quarters. He needed a longer weapon to keep animals or unforeseen threats at bay. He ventured deeper into a stand of young pines until he found a straight sapling about his height. Its bark was smooth, and its diameter matched his forearm. He knelt and slashed the pocket knife into the trunk just above a knot, then pried it free with a gentle twist. The sapling fell with a muted thud, and he set to work peeling its bark in long, curling strips. Using his knife, Eli carved one end of the pole into a tapered point, rotating it against a sturdy stone to shave off wood until it was sharp enough to pierce against resistance. Sweat beaded at his temple as he worked the pole back and forth, testing the sharpened tip against a piece of deadwood until it sunk in slightly without splitting. This spear, he decided, could ward off curious animals or serve as a walking staff across uncertain ground. He ran his hand along its length, feeling its balance, and tucked it beside his pack. Next, he turned his attention to trapping small game. Once he had water and some foraged nuts, protein would become essential to sustain his strength. He recalled his grandfather's stories of making rabbit snares with twisted vines and bent saplings. He knelt by a fallen oak whose roots created hooks above the soil. Selecting a supple vine among the tangle, he snapped off a length and wound its inner fibers around a small rock, twisting until the vine's strands separated and formed fibrous strands ideal for cordage. He stripped the outer layer away, revealing durable inner strands. He wove those strands into a simple snare noose, twisting and braiding until it held its shape but retained enough give to tighten around a small animal. For the trigger mechanism, he carved a forked stick, 2 prongs at one end, then sharpened the tips so they could grab the snare's loop. He fashioned a trigger stick by whittling a notch into its side, creating a catch that, when released, would pull the loop taut. The entire contraption felt delicate in his small hands, but he tested it by placing a pebble in the loop and gently tugging the forked trigger. With a soft snap, the loop closed, the trigger sprang free, and the test pebble was held fast. Grateful for the proof of concept, Eli slung the snare carefully over his shoulder and chose a promising location, a narrow path between dense ferns where wildlife tracks crisscrossed. He dug a small pit at knee level, covering it with loosely woven sticks and leaves so it blended into the forest floor. He positioned the snare above the pit, its loop just inches above ground level, and anchored the trigger under the leaf litter. Heart pounding, he backed away, imagining a curious rabbit's nose brushing the leaves, triggering the mechanism. With that set, Eli allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. The trap would work whether he remained nearby or ventured elsewhere to gather more tools. He jotted a quick tally: 1 snare, set on a scrap of bark using a stick's tip, then placed the bark inside his pack for reference. His next invention answered another need, collecting edible roots. He trudged toward an area where the soil looked loose and crumbly, indicated by tufts of grass springing free. Kneeling, he brushed away debris until he uncovered turgid white roots, wild parsnip, he hoped. He tested the smell, careful to avoid poisonous varieties, and recalled his mother's rule: if it smells bitter, spit it out. The root gave a faint, earthy fragrance. Using his sharpened stick, he dug around the root's base, loosening soil until he could pull up a small cluster. To prepare these for future meals, he needed a digging tool. Selecting a sturdy stick with a forked end, he wedged the fork around the root and leveraged upward, extracting the entire plant. He snapped the leafy top off and buried it back where he'd found it, hoping new shoots might grow. He scraped the root clean with his knife, then cut it into manageable segments, each about 2 inches long, and stored them in a section of his poncho, wrapping them gently to keep dirt off his other supplies. The sun had climbed high overhead, shifting shadows beneath the trees. Eli wiped his brow on his kerchief and surveyed his growing tool cache: a sharpened sapling spear, a set snare in the ferns, and a pouch of wild roots. But he still lacked a means to ignite a fire. He pondered friction-based methods, bow drill or hand drill, but such techniques required dry tinder, careful drill, wood selection, and patience. His hands, slightly numb from the morning chill, might slip. He could collect materials now and attempt ignition when his fingers warmed in the sun. First, however, he needed a container to hold water beyond his bottle's capacity. He remembered that hollowed logs could serve as troughs. He traced his way back to the creek and searched its bank for a fallen log, one sturdy enough that he could carve a channel, yet light enough to move. He found a length of cedar, half submerged in the water, its wood soft and free of rot. Dragging it to a flat clearing, he set to work carving. With his knife, Eli scored 2 parallel lines along the log's length, then began gouging out the center between them. Chips of wet wood fell in small curls slick with moisture. He worked patiently, taking breaks to pulse his numb fingers between his arms. The interior became a shallow trough capable of holding nearly a liter of water. He tested its integrity by pouring creek water inside. Though some seeped through tiny cracks, most collected in the hollow. Pressing his palm to the log's interior, he could feel the heft of water it contained. Satisfied, he carried the new container back to the creek, filled both it and his bottle, and then turned toward his lean-to. The walk back felt triumphant. He carried not only the fruits of his labors, but tangible evidence of his growing mastery over the wild. Each tool represented a problem solved: a spear for protection, a snare for food, a trough for water, roots for nutrition. When he reached the lean-to, Eli set down his containers and laid out his tools like a field kit. The lean-to's entrance frame danced with sunlight, revealing the comfort and security of the shelter he'd built. He placed the spear by the entrance, the snare staked into the ground nearby, and the trough beside his water bottle. He anticipated using the roots for a simple stew once he learned to start a fire. As he organized his workspace, he felt a deep, satisfying calm. Where fear had reigned, resourcefulness now ruled. The forest, once an indifferent observer, seemed to acknowledge his efforts with a slight breeze that ruffled the leaves overhead. The game trap, the sharpened spear, these were more than tools. They were statements of his intent to endure. He gathered small twigs and dry leaves to create a tinder bundle, stuffing them into a corner of his trunk shelter where they would stay sheltered and dry. Tomorrow, when the sun's warmth had restored feeling to his hands, he would attempt to coax a spark. For now he rested, pressing his palms together in silent gratitude for the forest's bounty. As the afternoon waned, Eli leaned against the oak inside his lean-to, watching shafts of light flicker through the canopy. In this moment, he was both the student and the teacher. Every broken twig and discarded stone had a lesson to impart. And with each lesson, the gap between the wild and himself narrowed. He closed his eyes, fingers brushing the spear's smooth shaft, and let a small smile touch his lips. He had become more than a lost boy. He was a creator, a maker of his own safety and sustenance. The wood whispered around him, and he felt for the first time a fragile kinship with the forest's rhythms. Night would come again, but with tomorrow's light, he would be ready, tools in hand, mind sharpened, and heart unbowed. Late afternoon sunlight filtered through the canopy as Eli sat inside his lean-to, fingers tracing the smooth shaft of his newly carved spear. The forest seemed at peace, birdsong mingling with the distant rustle of small creatures. He closed his eyes, savoring the moment of calm before gathering fire-starting materials. But nature's tranquility can shift in an instant. A distant rumble rolled through the treetops, low and warning, and Eli's chest tightened. He peered through the lean-to's entrance and saw dark clouds gathering beyond the ridge, their edges rimmed in slate and violet. He rose swiftly, heart pounding. The afternoon breeze twisted into a gust, rattling the branches overhead and sending a spray of pine needles dancing through the air. Eli's mind raced. Storms could turn dangerous, fast-flooded gully, falling branches soaked tinder. He grabbed his tinder bundle and the sharpened stick for fire starting, then scooped up his water trough and bottle. If he could get a fire going quickly, the warmth and dry smoke would keep him safe and discourage nocturnal predators. Outside, the wind gusted stronger, bending the young sapling spear he'd staked near the lean-to's entrance. Eli braced himself against the oak trunk and peered into the sky. Clouds collided in roiling masses, and a flash of lightning lit the forest in stark silhouette. Thunder cracked overhead closer this time, a deafening boom that shook the ground beneath his boots. The storm was upon him before he realized how close it had come. Dropping his pack, he dashed to the lean-to's entrance and dragged in several long branches, stacking them against the back wall. He draped his poncho over the pile to shield them from rain, then knelt to stoke the tinder bundle, arranging small twigs beneath the bark shavings. He stripped thin slivers of bark from a birch pole to serve as kindling, laying them in a crisscross pattern. He struck the flint edge of his pocket knife against a rough stone to create sparks, the first attempts sputtering out in gray puffs of smoke. Beads of rain began to hiss on the poncho's surface like tiny drums. Lightning flickered, followed by thunder that rattled his teeth. Cold drops spattered Eli's cheek, stinging like pins, but he persisted, strike, smoke, then another spark, then another, until a faint ember glowed among the bark shreds. His breath steamed as he gently blew on the ember, feeding it oxygen. The ember flared to life, flickering into a fragile flame that licked at the kindling. He added a few more twigs, cautiously shielding the nascent fire with his body as rain began to pelt the lean-to's roof in a relentless drumming. Within moments, small flames lapped at the bundle, and warmth blossomed against his chest. Eli exhaled in relief, carefully feeding the fire larger branches he'd dragged inside. The lean-to's interior glowed in the trembling light smoke, curling upward and seeking an escape through the roof's thatch. The heat drove back the chill that had settled in his bones, and the scent of burning pine mingled with wet earth. He pressed his palms against the warmth, grounding himself in the crackling comfort. Outside, the storm raged in full fury. Rain lashed the trees, turning the forest floor slick and treacherous. Branches snapped under the wind's strain, and a nearby tree groaned ominously. Lightning illuminated the lean-to's thin walls, casting jagged shadows across the interior. Eli watched the tempest from his shelter's mouth and felt both awe and alarm. The wild had shown its might. Water seeped through a small gap in the poncho's coverage, forming a slender trickle that ran down the inner wall. Eli set a stone in its path to divert the flow toward his water trough, capturing more supply. He knew he couldn't let the fire falter. Without it, hypothermia would follow, and the night would be long and merciless. He collected a handful of small debris from the lean-to's floor-dry scraps that had fallen into the shelter and tossed them onto the fire, watching them vanish in bursts of ember and smoke. As the storm howled, Eli reflected on how his fortunes had shifted. The fire, once an abstract goal, now roared as a barrier between him and the cold. Each spark had been earned through determination and skill. Outside, the forest drank deeply every root fern and stone bathed in rain. The lean-to strained under the deluge, but held its shape a testament to Eli's craftsmanship. The thunder rolled away into the distance, but rain continued in sheets, turning the world beyond the shelter into a curtain of gray. Eli pulled the kerchief from his wrist and wrung it above the fire, watching droplets sputter into the flames. He draped the damp cloth over his shoulders and pressed it against his cheeks, savoring the residual warmth. He gathered his thoughts. Tomorrow he would need to inspect the shelter for damage, gather fresh tinder, and perhaps reinforce the lean-to's roof. But now, in the eye of his small sanctuary, he allowed himself a moment of calm. He leaned back against the oak trunk, arms wrapped around his knees, and let the fire's glow chase away shadows. As the blazing logs settled into glowing coals, Eli stared into their depths, feeling both humbled and emboldened. He thought of his family, how they would marvel at his resourcefulness, but worry at the storm's fury. He whispered into the smoke, "I'm here, and I'm ready." The flame crackled in answer, and for the first time since the storm began, he closed his eyes, comforted by the barrier between him and the tempest. Outside, the wind clawed at the lean-to's walls, but inside, the fire sang a lullaby of survival. Eli stayed awake, tending the coals, nursing the flame, with fragments of branch and tinder, until the rain's rhythm softened into a gentle patter. In the shifting glow, he saw sparks that looked like stars, and he drifted into a wakeful doze, firelight dancing across his face. When the storm finally subsided, the world felt cleansed, fresh alive, with dripping leaves and subdued wildlife stirrings. Eli's lean-to had endured, and so had he. In the intimate warmth of his fire, he knew the forest's lessons were far from over, but tonight He had conquered the storm's fury, and that victory warmed him more than any blaze. Dawn uncovered a battered world. Leaves drooped under droplets, broken branches speckled the ground, and the lean-to's poncho roof sagged where it collected rainwater. Eli stirred beside the smoldering coals, bones stiff, but spirit unbowed. He poked the coals gently, coaxing them back to glowing embers, then sat up, feeling a sharp twinge in his left ankle. His heart sank. He tested it gingerly, shifting weight from heel to toe. Pain flared like a hot brand. Somehow during last night's storm, or in the scramble to gather firewood, he must have twisted it. He exhaled slowly, closing his eyes against the throbbing. A broken ankle could spell disaster, but Eli refused to see it that way. He pressed a fist to his chest, recalling his mother's calm words. "Your body can surprise you if you treat it with respect." He would treat this injury as part of his journey. He reached for his pocket knife, then paused. He needed to stabilize the joint before moving, but sterile bandages were a luxury he didn't have. Instead, he dug into his pack and retrieved the silver poncho. With the precision he'd used to build his shelter, Eli tore a strip of the poncho's edge, thin but sturdy, and fashioned it into a makeshift band. He folded it to minimize chafing, then wrapped it firmly around his ankle, anchoring it above and below the swollen area. He tied the ends in a double knot, testing the binding for snugness, tight enough to support loose enough to allow circulation. A faint ache and a sense of security replaced the sharp pain. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it would have to do. Next, he needed padding to cushion the ankle. He rummaged in his pack, pulling out the bottle's empty wax paper wrapper and the small leftover granola fragments. He crumpled the paper into a soft pad and tucked it between his ankle and the poncho wrap. The granola crumbs provided minute cushioning, an improvised soft liner that made each shuffle less jarring. He winced as he flexed his foot. The makeshift brace held firm. Eli leaned back, centering himself on the oak trunk. He had to decide press onward, despite the injury, or rest until the swelling subsided. His goal was clear: find his family or safety, but every step risked worsening the sprain. He thought of his father's words: "Slow is smooth, smooth is fast." Today, slow would be necessary. If he hurried and re-injured himself, he might be unable to travel at all. He rose with careful deliberation and hobbled to the lean-to's entrance, using his spear as a crutch. The wood's smooth shaft and tapered tip provided balance on the wet forest floor. Each step demanded focus: plant the spear shift weight, advance the injured foot, then the good one. This cadence became his new mantra: spear step, until he reached the creek's edge a few feet away. He knelt by the water, letting the cold flow over his ankle. The chill stung, but also reduced the swelling. He scooped water into his cupped hands and splashed it gently around the joint, mindful of his fragile bind. As he worked, he surveyed the creek bank for leafy plants, wild comfrey or yarrow, whose leaves could serve as natural compresses. He spotted several broad green leaves beneath a low-hanging branch. He pulled a few, washed them in the creek, then layered them over the wrapped ankle, pressing firmly to hold them in place. The leaves' cool, moist surface pressed against his skin like a balm. Eli let the water and herbal leaves do their work while he sat on a stone sipping a rationed pinch of granola and water. Hunger and thirst were constant companions, but managing the ankle took precedence. He closed his eyes, letting the forest's shifting palette of light and sound settle his mind. The creek's steady gurgle and the wind's murmur through the leaves formed a healing chorus. After 10 minutes, he removed the leaves, folded them, and tucked them into his pack. The swelling had receded slightly, and the pain dulled to a constant throb. It was still tender, but the combination of splinting and cold compress had bought him mobility. He rose, spear in hand, and tested his weight again. The ankle held enough for the day's journey if he paced himself. His goal climbed the ridge that he'd glimpsed beyond the creek to gain vantage and possibly spot rescue teams. Though the climb would jostle the ankle, the view could reveal the path to safety. Eli embraced the challenge. He set off along the creek bank, spear steadying him each step measured. The forest floor sloped upward toward the ridge, first gentle, then steep. Eli paused at each change in incline, breathing deeply to keep his focus. His spear tip sank into the soil, providing extra grip on loose gravel. Leaves crunched underfoot, and he tuned his hearing to detect any sign of others' voices, footsteps, or even the distant drone of a search helicopter. Midway up the slope, he paused beside a cluster of mossy rocks and drank from his water containers, rinsing his mouth and moistening his lips. The climb made him sweat despite the morning chill, and his kerchief dampened beneath his chin. He unfolded a small piece of bark and scratched tally marks. Climb attempt 1 as a record. Each notch was both a testament to progress and a morale booster. Resuming, he ascended more slowly, his ankle burning with each push, but his resolve sharpened like a blade. The forest canopy thinned, and sunlight dappled the path, illuminating hidden roots he navigated like stepping stones. He used the spear to vault over deeper gullies and to steady himself on rocky ledges. The ridge's lip loomed above, crowned by twisted pines that braced against wind. At last, he hauled himself onto the ridge's crest, chest heaving with exertion. The world opened before him, a panorama of rolling hills, forested valleys, and patches of golden meadow where sunlight kissed the grass. In the distance, he saw a narrow dirt road cutting through the trees, faint but unmistakable. Hope surged in his chest. If that road led to a trailhead or ranger station, he might direct rescuers or even walk to civilization despite his injury. He knelt, heart pounding, and sketched a quick map in the dirt with his Spear Creek lean-to ridge road. He buried the sketch beneath a flat stone as a marker should he return. Then, leaning on his spear, he studied the road's path. It wound toward a cluster of buildings, perhaps cabins, or a park office barely visible at the horizon's edge. He shaded his eyes and watched no vehicles, no figures yet, but the day was still young. Eli's chest swelled with triumph and exhaustion. He had braved a personal trial, tended his injury, and achieved a vantage that brought him closer to rescue. The ankle throbbed sharply as he shifted weight to stand, but he steadied himself with the spear. He whispered a vow. For my family, I'll make it down there. He had transformed pain into purpose, and now, even limping, He felt unstoppable. He rested a moment more, catching his breath in the high ridge air, then turned toward the slope leading down to the road. Each step would matter, but he carried proof of his strength: a splinted ankle, a carved ridgeline map, and the unwavering belief he could go on. With spear in hand and vision fixed on the distant cabins, Eli began his next descent, each measured step taking him closer to home. Eli paused on the ridge's crest, spear planted firmly in the soil beside him, and allowed his gaze to wander across the distant road and sunlit meadow. The wind tugged at his hair and kerchief, carrying with it the scent of pine resin and thawing earth. A hollow ache of loneliness washed over him. He was the only living soul within miles. Yet that solitude also kindled something fierce inside him, a determination to leave behind markers of his passage, a silent testament to his presence, and a guide for whoever might come after. He retrieved his pocket knife, and with practiced precision held the blade against the bark of a nearby pine. He drew a deep breath and carved a simple arrow pointing downhill, followed by 2 parallel vertical lines, his personal symbol for hope. The fresh wound bled sap like tears, but he pressed the knife gently to smooth the edges. Later, rescuers or his father might recognize these markings, following them back toward safety. More than that, each carving buoyed his spirits, a message to himself that he was not truly alone. Stepping back, Eli surveyed the tree line. The ridge was dotted with saplings, birches, and old-growth hemlocks, the perfect canvases for his symbols. He counted 5, 1 for each day he'd survived, each a chapter of hardship and triumph. He moved to the next sturdy trunk, turned the blade, and etched a second symbol, a circle intersected by a line to denote the creek's location below. The shallow grooves barked in protest, but they held firm against the breeze. With 3 symbols in place, Eli felt the tension in his shoulders ease slightly. He pointed his spear toward the road beyond the ridgeline, then traced its path with a shaky finger. Despite the pain in his ankle, his vision sharpened. He would carve 1 symbol per landmark, creating a breadcrumb trail of meaning and direction. If his family's search party picked up the signs, they'd know he'd climbed this ridge and pressed onward. He moved along the high ground, bending at the waist, to reach each tree's lower trunk, his sprained ankle throbbing with every shift of weight. Yet carving brought focus, lessening the ache in his mind, if not his foot. On a gnarled hemlock, he carved a trefoil to signify the stand of wild almonds, the unexpected bounty that had bolstered his strength. On a slender birch, he etched a spiral marking the root patch where he'd unearthed wild parsnip. Each symbol was a shorthand for a memory, a mnemonic device linking place and meaning. As he carved, shadows lengthened the ridge's eastern face, spilling into dusk. Eli finished his 5th symbol, a small star with radiating lines, indicating his lean-to shelter just below the ridge. He stood back to admire the row of carvings, arrow parallel lines, circle cross trefoil spiral, and star. Together, they read like a secret map, from summit to shelter, to creek, to food patches, to homeward route. He paused to press his palm against the last carving, closing his eyes. He whispered words he'd never share aloud to anyone but himself. "I will make it." The wind answered with a gentle sigh, rustling the needles overhead as if applauding his resolve. Hope, once flickering, now glowed steady and bright within him. Night would come swiftly, and the forest could be disorienting under starlight. He needed to descend to the lean-to before darkness swallowed the path. But he also needed lighting for the journey. No torch, no lantern, just his own resourcefulness. He rummaged in his pack, finding the wax paper wrapper and remaining granola crumbs. A plan formed. He could craft a makeshift candle, using the wrapper as a wick and the residual oil in the granola as fuel. It wouldn't burn long, but enough to navigate the first few hundred feet downhill. He unwrapped the wax paper, flattening it gently. The translucent sheet flexed, and he folded it lengthwise into a thin wick. Using his knife's tip, he scraped the surface of the granola remnants, collecting oily crumbs into a small pile. He pressed the crumbs together, rolling them into a teardrop shape. At its base, he inserted one end of the wick, compacting more crumbs around it until it resembled a crude candle. It smelled faintly of oats and honey, a far cry from beeswax, but potentially combustible. Eli set the candle on a flat stone, struck a spark with his knife and a flint-like rock, and watched as the wick flared into a small, flickering flame. The light trembled against the darkening woods, offering a fragile glow that seemed to defy the gathering night. He cupped his hands around it, shielding it from wind, and tested its burn rate. It would last only minutes enough to guide him to the first arrow carving. Carefully, he blew out the flame, leaving the wick smoldering. He pressed it upright within a sliver of bark, securing it in place beside the carving. A tiny point of light danced against the tree, a beacon in the dusk. Eli exhaled his breath, a visible puff in the cooling air. He slung his pack onto his good shoulder, gripped his spear like a torch, and began the descent. The candle's glow pulsed as he moved, illuminating rocks and roots that otherwise would have caused missteps. Each time the flame waned, he knelt, coaxed it back to life with gentle breaths, and advanced to the next carving. The parallel lines marked the spot where he'd paused to honor his days of survival. The circle cross marked the creek that still whispered below. The trefoil and spiral carved into bark guided him like a lanterned path. By the time he reached the star carving above his lean-to, the candle burned low, its flame a thin thread of light. He crossed himself, grateful for the guideposts he'd created. The last few steps were in near darkness, but he trusted the map he'd etched into the forest. The lean-to emerged as a shadowy outline against the night sky, and he stumbled inside, quelling a surge of relief. He extinguished the candle, crushed its base into the soil as a final testament to his resourcefulness, and leaned against the oak trunk. His ankle throbbed, but felt manageable after hours of bracing focus. He closed his eyes and allowed his heartbeat to slow the ridge's panorama, replaced by the close embrace of his lean-to. As his vertigo-dulled mind drifted between wakefulness and sleep, he thought of his carvings, lanterns of hope, among the trees. Each held a story, perseverance, ingenuity, and the unbreakable thread of belief that guided him home. Darkness no longer felt like an enemy. It was simply another chapter in his odyssey, one lit by his own carved symbols and the candle of his will. Eli awoke to a soft nudge against his shoulder, a gentle, insistent pressure that pulled him from the haze of sleep. His vision fluttered open to the dim interior of the lean-to, illuminated by pre-dawn light filtering through the thatch. The embers of last night's fire glowed faintly at his feet, offering a ribbon of warmth that eased his stiff body. For a moment, he lay still, heart thumping, with both surprise and curiosity. What had ventured so close? Another nudge this time, accompanied by a soft whine. Eli blinked, then shifted his head and saw a pair of golden eyes staring at him, framed by matted fur, caked in mud, and tiny clumps of pine needles. A dog, lean, wary, and wounded, pressed its snout against his hand. Its ribs showed through its coat, and a shallow scrape on its flank oozed a thin line of dried blood. For a heartbeat, Eli feared it might be aggressive, but the gentle tail wag and careful posture spoke of need rather than threat. He slipped out of the lean-to, careful to brace his ankle with his spear, and knelt in front of the animal. The dog backed away slightly, as if wary of kindness. Eli's heart clenched. "Hey there," he murmured softly, offering his palm. The dog sniffed and then brushed its head against his hand, thankful for the warmth. Eli smiled, his loneliness lifting in a rush. He patted the dog's head gingerly, avoiding the wounded area. The dog let out a relieved sigh, tail sweeping the pine needle floor twice. It lowered itself into a gentle bow. Front legs splayed, then lay down tentatively beside Eli, its head turning to rest on his thigh. In that quiet moment, companionship filled the lean-to, joining the warmth of the embers. Eli slid his pack from his back and produced a small piece of wax paper-wrapped granola. He unwrapped it and offered a tiny bite. The dog sniffed, then lapped it gratefully, crumbs dusting its muzzle. Eli's chest swelled with empathy. "You're hungry, aren't you?" He nodded as if the dog had answered in words. He tore off 2 more pebbled bits and fed them carefully, watching the animal's strength return with each chew. The dog's ribs became less prominent as its hunger eased. Then Eli noticed the scrape on its flank wasn't just dried blood. It was a raw wound, likely from a hidden branch or a trap. He pressed a finger gently to inspect, causing the dog to flinch. Guilt pricked Eli's stomach. It needed care. He rummaged in his pack for the silver poncho, finding a spare strip of material he could use as a makeshift bandage. He dug out the charred remains of his tinder bundle, small soft pine needles, and used them to gently clean the wound, brushing away dried grit. The dog whimpered softly, but held still, trusting Eli's touch. He rinsed the fibers in his water container, then patted the area dry with clean twigs stripped of needles until no moisture remained. Next, he cut a narrow strip of poncho material, folded it to create a soft pad, and tied it around the dog's flank with a careful knot. It was crude, but snug enough to protect the wound from dirt. The dog wagged its tail once in thanks. Eli patted its side, marveling at the warmth that friendship could bring. "I think I'll call you Bear," he said, recalling the animal's tawny coat and gentle strength. Bear lifted his head, amber eyes brightening as if he understood. Eli eased back inside the lean-to, Bear following and settling by the embers. He wrapped his poncho tighter around his shoulders, longing for the return of warmth. He glanced at his dwindling supplies and knew he would need to share rations. But with Bear by his side, he felt an ember of hope ignite in his chest. The forest no longer seemed as daunting. Together, they would face whatever came next. As the first bird song heralded dawn, Eli rose on unsteady legs and retrieved his water trough and bottle. Bear limped along, taking careful paw steps as if mirroring Eli's cautious gait. Outside, the world glistened with dew. The forest seemed to lean in, curious about this new pair. Eli filled the trough at the creek and scooped fresh water for Bear in a small hollowed stone. He knelt and encouraged the dog to drink. Bear lapped eagerly, then licked Eli's hand in gratitude. They returned to the lean-to, where Eli spread out a thin layer of moss he'd saved for insulation. Bear settled onto it with a sigh, as if claiming his spot in this renewed sanctuary. Eli set the water trough close to his own space and smiled at the transformation where only a boy had rested before now two souls shared the shelter. Eli's thoughts turned to the day's tasks, reinforcing the lean-to roof, gathering tinder, and perhaps starting on a trail that might lead closer to that distant road. But now he also had to consider Bear's needs, food, water, and safety from forest dangers. He unrolled his small stash of wild root segments and offered one to Bear, watching as the dog sniffed and then swallowed it without hesitation. Encouraged, Eli munched on a tiny piece himself, the earthy flavor grounding him. He broke off another segment for Bear and tucked the remainder into his poncho's pocket. The morning light warmed the lean-to, and Eli felt Bear's steady breathing beside him. In return for the dog's companionship, Eli resolved to keep Bear safe. He gathered some small branches and leaves, weaving them into a soft bed around Bear's spot. Then, with his spear poised, he stepped outside to check the lean-to's roof. The poncho had sagged further under last night's rain, and some branches had shifted. He lifted the poncho's edge and resecured it with heftier stones, reinforcing the angle so water would run off more effectively. Bear limped out behind him, standing guard by the entrance as Eli worked. Occasionally, he would paw at the ground, as if sniffing for threats. Once, a distant howl rolled through the trees, but Bear's ears perked and he growled low, a protective rumble that made Eli feel safer than any carving or snare ever had. Together, they replaced a rotten branch with a fresh pine limb Eli had trimmed with his knife, weaving it into the framework. He tossed more leaves over the thatch to plug gaps while Bear kept vigilant watch. By mid-morning, the lean-to stood sturdier, its silver roof reflecting light like a promise. Eli surveyed their home and felt a swell of pride, not just in the work he'd done alone, but in the partnership he now shared. Bear's presence filled a void Eli hadn't realized he carried. Survival was no longer an isolated struggle, but a shared journey. Eli knelt beside Bear and scratched behind his ears, feeling the coarse fur soften under his fingers. "We'll find help," he whispered. The dog rested its head on Eli's knee, eyes half closed in trust. In that moment, the boy understood that companionship was perhaps the greatest tool nature had offered him. His resolve, once fueled solely by memories of his family, now included the steady heartbeat of a friend in fur. Bear stood and stretched, then sniffed along the lean-to's perimeter, checking for new scents. Eli retrieved his snare from the ferns and refilled it with the root segments he'd stored. He set it again on a narrow game path nearby, confident that Bear's company would deter unwanted visitors while small animals navigated the trap. Then, with water bottle and spear in hand, he prepared to journey out together to explore the creek's bends and forage new food sources. The forest, once a realm of solitude, had become a shared field of discovery. Each step and each breath carried the promise of survival, strengthened by the bond between boy and dog. Eli squared his shoulders, tightened the kerchief around his hair, and beckoned Bear with a soft whistle. The dog emerged from the lean-to with renewed energy, tail wagging in slow, steady arcs. As they set off down the creek bank, moving in tandem, Eli's spear tip echoing Bear's clipped paw. Steps the morning sun broke through the canopy, glinting on water droplets like tiny stars. Side by side, they ventured into the wild, forging a friendship that neither would forget. Eli and Bear pressed onward along the creek's winding edge, every step tested by the uneven roots and rain-softened soil. The dawn light danced on the water's ripples as they approached the gully that led up toward the ridge. Eli's ankle now braced and reinforced by layers of poncho and comfrey leaves held firm, but each step sent tiny fireworks of pain through his foot. Bear padded beside him, limping slightly, but alert, as if sharing both his companion's discomfort and determination. The gully rose steeply, the damp ground slick underfoot. Eli planted his spear's tip into the earth, leaning his weight onto it to counter the pull of gravity. Bear followed close, slipping once on a patch of wet moss before regaining his footing. The forest here felt ancient. Towering maples and hemlocks loomed overhead, and a tangle of ferns carpeted the floor. Sunlight filtered through high branches in pale mottles, illuminating drifting spores that swirled like tiny embers. About halfway up, Eli paused to catch his breath. He knelt on one knee, placing Bear's water-filled trough on a rock, and offered the dog a drink. Bear lapped gratefully, then nudged Eli's hand, as if urging him to do the same. Eli unscrewed his bottle cap and tilted it, letting cool creek water wash over his lips and tongue. The relief was immediate, but brief. He rose and surveyed the final stretch, steeper still, with exposed roots forming slippery steps between moss-covered boulders. He tightened his grip on the spear knuckles, whitening, and began the ascent. Each upward motion felt like a small victory spear step. Spear step. The ridge's crest lay hidden above a bend, the world opening only after the struggle. But halfway through, Bear froze hackles rising and emitted a low rumble. Eli halted, scanning the upward slope. At first he saw nothing, then caught movement, the white flash of bones against dark fur and a pair of eyes reflecting in the filtered light. A lone wolf, its coat grizzled and matted, stood at the gully's lip, crouched and wary. Eli's heart hammer blew time open. The wolf was larger than Bear lean, and powerful ribs showing through its fur. Its muzzle was flecked with dried blood, likely from its own desperate hunt. The animal froze as it sensed them, a tense standoff charged by mutual fear and hunger. Eli's mind raced wolves, preyed on wounded animals and uncertain targets. A boy on a splinted ankle, flanked by a dog, might ignite its predatory instincts. He pressed a finger to his lips, and Bear's rumble softened into a low whine. The wolf's ears flattened. It bared its teeth in a warning snarl. Eli raised his spear vertically, the tip glinting in the sun. He spoke in a calm, steady voice, one he summoned from some well of confidence, deeper than his fear. "We mean no harm," he croaked, just passing through. The wolf's eyes flicked between Eli's and Bear's, gauging their intent. For a heartbeat, it seemed as if the forest itself held its breath. Then a distant crack, a falling branch, startled the wolf. It dropped its head and took a tentative step forward, then another. Eli braced, tightening his grip, ready to jab if necessary. Bear growled softly, muscles coiling, but the wolf halted. It sniffed the air, then with deceptive grace, turned and slid down a parallel gully, melting into the trees with minimal sound. Eli exhaled in relief, lowering the spear. His legs trembled not just from the climb, but from the adrenaline that had seized him. Bear let out a soft whimper, then nudged Eli's hand for reassurance. He patted the dog's head, voice gentle. "You did good, Bear." They waited, listening to the forest's heartbeat, the drip of water from leaves, distant bird songs, until the tension eased. Eli scanned the slope above once more. It was clear. Together, they resumed the climb, but more cautiously. He chose a parallel spur slightly to the left, where boulders offered hand and toe holds, keeping them out of the direct line of the wolf's emergence. As they climbed, Eli's mind churned with the encounter's lessons, respect for the wild's inhabitants, awareness of his vulnerability, and the importance of non-aggression when possible. He realized that his spear was as much a deterrent as a weapon. Its presence, paired with calm posturing, had helped diffuse a potentially deadly confrontation. The final few yards tested their resolve. Moist stones threatened to betray their grip, and Eli's ankle cried out with each careful placement. Bear slipped once more, but Eli steadied him with a gentle hand on the dog's flank. Finally, they breached the ridge's lip and tumbled onto the crest, chest heaving and muscles trembling, but alive and triumphant. Above them, the sky arched wide and blue, broken only by high cotton clouds. The panorama stretched valleys flecked with sunlight, the distant road ribboning through the trees, and a cluster of buildings shimmering near the horizon. The wolf's territory lay behind them, its warning echoing in their ears. But ahead lay hope, a safer vantage point, a clear line of sight for miles. Eli collapsed onto a flat slab of rock spear across his knees, and Bear curled beside him, head resting on his thigh. He closed his eyes, letting the wind play through his hair, and absorbed the achievement of the climb. He whispered, "We made it," both to himself and to Bear, whose tail thumped once against the stone in response. He sat in that fragile calm for several minutes, studying the distant ridge of cabins and the road's faint glimmer. The path down would be slippery and steep, but gravity would work in their favor now that they were above the wolf's hunting ground. Eli tested his ankle by flexing it, gauging the pain. It was there, but tolerable, dulled by triumph, and the ridge's brisk air. He rose with effort and propped his spear over his shoulder. Bear rose at the same moment, shaking out his fur. Together they approached the ridge's edge, peering down the opposite slope. Sunlight spilled in golden ribbons, warming the grasses and illuminating the way. Eli traced the descent in his mind, a zigzag path between boulders and tree roots, avoiding large rocks that might shift under Bear's weight. As they began their descent, Eli glanced back toward the wolf's gully. The slope was silent now, no sign of the wolf or its tracks. He touched the shaft of his spear, grateful that it had served its purpose. With careful steps, he led Bear down into the haze of tree trunks, following the spine of the ridge toward salvation. The world below embraced them with filtered light and gentle breezes, and Eli's pulse steadied to a steady rhythm. Each step carried them farther from peril and closer to safety. Though the wolf still lurked somewhere in those woods, its threat had been weathered. Now, buoyed by the climb's victory, Eli pressed on, determined to reach the distant road before night fell. The slope leveled into a gentle meadow as Eli and Bear descended the forest, giving way to open air. Sunlight poured across tall grasses that swayed in soft waves, and a brisk breeze carried the scent of wildflowers, lupine goldenrod, and timid bluebells nodding their heads. Eli's ankle protested with each careful step, but the pain felt secondary to the exhilaration that pulsed through his veins. Ahead, the dirt road appeared wider now, its edges lined with weathered fencing and occasional telephone poles, an unmistakable sign of civilization. Yet, as each yard brought them closer, an undercurrent of doubt slithered through his mind. What if no one was on that road? What if it stretched on empty, leading him nowhere? The sun hung low in the sky, shadows lengthening across the meadow like dark fingers. Eli paused, spear braced in the ground, and gazed down the empty ribbon of dirt. No headlights glinted, no distant voices drifted. His breath caught in his throat, fear whispering that all his effort might end here at the edge of human reach. Bear pressed close, nudging Eli's hand, and Eli closed his eyes, drawing comfort from the dog's steady presence. In that silent communion, he felt a resurgence of the resolve that had carried him this far. He recalled his mother's words during bedtime stories, "When hope feels like slipping sand, tighten your grip on your purpose." His purpose was clear: find others, find home. He inhaled the meadow's heady perfume, letting the breeze wash away doubt. Each inhale was a promise, each exhale a release of fear. He would not allow uncertainty to eclipse his determination. Steeling himself, he squatted by the road's edge and scraped a notch into the soil with his spear, a wide arrow pointing toward the distant buildings, followed by his symbol of hope, 2 parallel lines. If rescuers followed the road, they would find his message. He pressed his hand to the damp earth, sealing his vow. Then, gathering his courage, he took the first step onto the road itself. The hard-packed dirt crunched under his boots, a new sensation after days of soft forest floor. The road sloped gently upward, curving toward a cluster of wooden cabins nestled among evergreens. Faint tire ruts suggested recent travel, but no vehicles stirred now. Eli watched the cabins grow larger, their peaked roofs offering promise of shelter supplies, perhaps even communications phones, radios, anything. His pace slowed as the sun dipped behind the western hills, painting the sky in streaks of amber and rose. He needed to reach those cabins before darkness swallowed the road. Bear matched his stride, tail held low, but wagging in cautious optimism. Together they moved forward, each footstep echoing their unspoken mantra: hope over fear, purpose over doubt. About halfway to the buildings, Bear stiffened, ears pricking. A sudden bark cracked the quiet, and Eli's heart raced. A green truck rounded the bend, headlights off but engine idling. The driver, a park ranger in uniform, stepped out, flashlight in hand, voice calling out, "Hello, is someone there?" Relief overwhelmed Eli in a rush so powerful it brought tears to his eyes. He dropped his spear and limped toward the ranger, arms outstretched. The ranger knelt, voice gentle. "You're safe now. What's your name?" Eli swallowed hard, voice trembling. Eli Harper. I'm 10. The ranger's hand rested on his shoulder, warm reassurance in physical form. Bear barked softly, nuzzling the ranger's leg. The ranger smiled, radio crackling. "We've got him. Please come in." Eli's heart that thundered as the ranger led him and Bear to the truck. He turned for a final glance down the road that had both haunted and guided him. In the fading light, his carved arrow remained clear, pointing toward salvation. He touched his pocket knife, an old friend that had become his lifeline, and whispered to Bear, "We did it." As the truck's taillights vanished down the road, Eli looked at the cabin cluster ahead, a new chapter waiting. Fear might have flickered at the meadow's fringe, but his will had blazed brighter, forging a path through doubt's shadows. And now, with help at hand, he felt a surge of joy so pure it banished every lingering tremor of fear. Between the forest's verdant walls and the open road, he had discovered a truth. When hope falters, resolve must rise, and he had held it fast. Eli settled into the back of the ranger's truck, Bear curled on a blanket beside him, and watched the forest recede through the window. The world he'd known only days before, towering pines, hidden creeks, and silent ridges slid away under the steady hum of the engine. His ankle throbbed gently against the seat, a reminder of every step that had carried him here. He pressed his hand to the window's cool glass fingertips, tracing the blurry green of the trees, and felt a soft ache of longing for the wild's raw embrace. Across from him, the park ranger introduced himself as Officer Martinez, his voice warm and steady. He offered Eli a thermos of hot tea and a soft blanket. Eli accepted both, cradling the mug between his palms. Steam spiraled up to meet his breath, filling him with comfort. Bear nosed the tea with a clumsy sniff, then lay his head cheek on Eli's lap, content to share in the warmth. For the first time since the lean-to's flickering firelight, Eli felt the wild's tension ebbing from his muscles. As they drove along the dirt road, cabins came into view, sturdy wooden facades with smoke curling from chimneys. Children's laughter drifted on the wind, and distant voices called greetings across porches. The sudden swirl of friendly life felt both jarring and wonderful. Eli's heart fluttered. Here were people who would marvel at his journey, who would bring him blankets and food and call his parents. But he also felt a pang of guilt for leaving Bear behind in varying degrees of care. The ranger must have sensed his worry because he reached back and patted Bear's side. "Don't worry," he said. "We'll make arrangements for him." They pulled into a small clearing beside the park office where police cruisers and medical vehicles waited. Martinez helped Eli down, wrapping the blanket more snugly around his shoulders before stepping back to let paramedics check his ankle. Eli crouched beside Bear as a nurse gently unwrapped the makeshift brace. The swelling had reduced, and after a quick assessment, they confirmed a moderate sprain. "You'll need to rest it for a few days," she advised kindly, "but you'll be walking again soon." Eli nodded relief, threading through him. He'd feared a cast, or worse, that he'd never leave the woods on his own feet again. Bear's tail thumped once, as though he understood the good news. Eli scooped the dog into his arms, cradling him like a small sibling, and whispered, "You're okay, boy." A moment later, Eli spotted two figures racing toward him, his mother and father faces etched with fear that melted into joy. His mother called his name and then enveloped him in a hug so tight he thought he might disappear into her arms. His father knelt beside them, brushing tears from his eyes as he patted Bear's head, calling him a hero. Eli felt his own tears break free, but they were tears of relief, of reunion, of safety, and he let them fall as he clung to the warmth of family. They guided him and Bear into the park office's lobby, where a small crowd had gathered volunteers, search and rescue team members, and cabin dwellers who had offered shelter. Each face greeted him with wide eyes and congratulations. A well-dressed reporter waited with a microphone, but Eli's mother gently steered him away toward a quiet corner. Later, she promised, "First, you need your family." In a cell lined with cozy couches, a hot meal appeared: chicken soup, bread, and warm apple slices. Eli ate slowly, every spoonful a celebration of taste and nourishment. Bear sat at his feet, given a bowl of fresh water and bits of chicken by a kind volunteer. The dog ate eagerly, then nuzzled Eli's leg with affectionate gratitude. Eli laughed, the sound raw with joy. He rubbed behind Bear's ears, murmuring, "I never could have done this without you." His father produced a tiny trophy, one of those plastic figures mounted on a marble base, and placed it on the table. "For the bravest boy in the woods," he said, voice thick. Eli's sister, who had arrived quietly with their grandmother, slipped in beside him, handing him a handmade card decorated with pine cone prints and painted ferns. Inside, she'd written, "Welcome home, hero." Eli's heart swelled at every mark of love. Wrapped in the cocoon of family and friends, Eli retold his journey in halting bursts, rations measured in sips and bites. The shelter he'd built, the howling storm, the sharpening of tools, the lonely carvings guiding him back, and the wolf's fearful standoff. Each memory was met with gasps and laughter and tears. When he spoke of Bear's gentle companionship, his mother pressed her hand to her mouth, and his father nodded solemnly. "You two make quite the team," the ranger observed, handing Eli a patch embroidered with a mountain and a paw print, "for never giving up." By late afternoon, The crowd thinned, leaving the family to gather around a wooden bench outside the office. Sunlight glinted off the windows, warming the brickwork. Eli's mother wrapped her arms around both Eli and Bear. He leaned into her embrace, feeling the steady rise and fall of her breath, and realized how much the wild had changed him. He was still 10, but something deep inside felt older, tempered like a blade forged in fire. Quiet settled over them as the sun dipped low. Eli's gaze drifted to Bear, who rested his head on Eli's boot, eyes half closed. In that serene moment, Eli understood the true lessons of survival patience. In the face of fear, resourcefulness, born of necessity, and the power of companionship, whether two-legged or four. He reached down and patted Bear's side. Bear looked up, tail giving a slow, contented wag. Eli's father squeezed his shoulder. "Let's get you home," he said softly. "Your mom made your favorite stew." Eli's gaze lifted to the cabins, clustered beyond the parking lot homes that reminded him of his own. He hesitated, the forest's call still murmured in his heart, a gentle whisper of adventure and self-discovery. But then he felt the pulse of his family's love, strong and steady, anchoring him here. He took one last look at the wild ridges framed by the office windows, committing their silhouettes to memory. He breathed in the cool air, tasting the faint pine on the breeze, and whispered to himself, "Thank you." Then he turned toward the warmth of home, waiting beyond the doors, Bear at his heels, and took his father's hand as they walked away together. Eli stepped across the threshold of his family's cabin, with Bear padding close behind, ears perked and tail swaying in cautious joy. His mother's stew simmered gently on the stove, filling the cozy room with its savory warmth. Sunlight filtered through lace curtains, casting golden patterns on the wooden floorboards. His father knelt beside a worn, woven rug, placing Eli's muddy boots on a towel and brushing loose pine needles into a small pile. The familiarity of home, the gentle clutter of books, the faint scent of last week's bread, baking, wrapped around Eli like a soft blanket after the harsh wind of the wilderness. His sister bounded forward, arms wide. "Eli," she cried, and Eli crouched to meet her, Bear nudging them both in a three-way embrace. Laughter bubbled from Eli's lips, bright and unguarded. It was good to laugh, he realized, no rationed sips or cautious steps, just pure delight. His father rose, hands on hips, surveying the two with pride. "Welcome home, champ," he rumbled, and Eli's heart swelled at the word. Eli's mother ushered them to the table, ladling generous bowls of stew. Bear sat expectantly at Eli's feet, receiving a bowl of broth and torn bread pieces. As Eli ate, his family listened with rapt attention as he recounted his journey in greater detail than he ever would have dared in public. He described the vanished trail markers, the rationed granola bites and sips of water, and the nights spent shivering, yet determined in the lean-to. He told of his improvised spear, the snares in the ferns, and the feast of wild almonds and parsnip roots. Animations of fox encounters and the wolf's silent challenge brought gasps and wide eyes. But above all, he spoke of Bear, how the dog's gentle presence had warmed the cold nights, how he'd nuzzled him awake, and how they had become a team. His mother's eyes glistened when she heard of the makeshift bandage, and his sister's brow furrowed with concern when he mentioned the twisted ankle. His father nodded gravely at the story of the storm's fury and the fire's triumphant crackle. Each tale wove itself into the fabric of the family's evening, binding them closer in shared wonder and relief. After dinner, the family gathered around the fireplace. A pot of hot tea steamed on the hearth, and Bear stretched out on a woven mat, curled peacefully. Eli reached into his pocket and withdrew a small wooden token he'd carved on the ridge, a simple star with radiating lines. He handed it to his sister. "For you," he said, "so you'll always remember our adventure." She accepted it reverently and slipped it into her pocket. His mother held his hand as she led him to the couch, tucking a knitted blanket around his shoulders. The fire crackled, sending golden embers dancing into the air. "You've grown so much, Eli," she whispered, smoothing his hair. "We're so proud." Eli leaned into her touch, feeling both smaller and stronger than he ever had before. Outside, night settled over the world in velvety darkness. The wind whispered through the pines, carrying the forest's hush to the cabin's windows. Inside, the fire's glow warmed every corner. Eli closed his eyes and let the crackling flames paint dreams of mossy banks and star-bright skies behind his eyelids. In the days that followed, Eli recovered fully, his ankle mending under gentle care. Each afternoon, he and Bear would step onto the cabin's porch and breathe in the forest's edge, no longer as a daunting unknown, but as a familiar friend. They walked slowly at first, Eli's hand on Bear's collar, then faster as his strength returned. They traced the creek's course where it met the meadow, spoke softly to the fox whose den lay hidden beneath roots, and watched the deer emerge at dusk. The forest's lessons, once about survival, became about harmony. Eli's family worked together to preserve the trail markers, replacing the missing signs, and adding his carved symbols, arrows, lines, and stars, to guide lost hikers. His story inspired a community project, building sturdy shelters along the trail, complete with emergency supplies and water stations. Eli helped design a small plaque commemorating his journey, installed beside a new observation deck on the ridge. His sister painted its illustration, a boy, a dog, and the forest's silhouette at dawn. On the evening of the shelter's unveiling, Eli stood beside the ridge overlook Bear at his side and watched neighbors and hikers gather. Officer Martinez delivered a speech about courage and resilience, and Eli's parents spoke of their son's bravery. Children pressed their faces against the railings, fascinated by the tokens of survival. His spear now mounted safely, a panel of carved symbols, and a small sealed jar of wild almond kernels. Eli's heart fluttered with pride, but it was not vanity he felt. It was gratitude for his family's unwavering love, for Bear's steadfast companionship, and for the forest's fierce, unyielding lessons. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in bands of rose and violet, Eli raised his hand in a silent salute to the woods. The trees stood sentinel, silent witnesses to his trial and triumph. And in that moment, he understood the wild was not an enemy to conquer, but a partner to respect. His journey had ended at this ridge, but its legacy would guide others forward. With Bear by his side and family at his back, Eli stepped away from the edge, carrying the forest's lessons in his heart. The glow of twilight softened the cabin's edges, and inside Eli sat by the fireplace, with Bear nestled at his feet. He cradled a warm mug of tea, its steam curling like gentle whispers. The crackling fire painted the room in dancing hues of amber and gold, each flicker a soft lullaby. Outside, the night air settled cool and serene, the forest's distant chorus of crickets and rustling leaves creating a soothing backdrop. Eli's heartbeat slowed, matching the fire's steady rhythm. Memories of rushing winds and crashing branches drifted away, replaced by the comforting weight of home. He wrapped himself in a thick blanket, its fibers soft, fragrant, with the scent of fresh wool and hearth smoke. Bear's steady breathing harmonized with his own, the dog's warmth, a quiet beacon against the gentle hush. Each sip of tea brought warmth that seeped into his bones, carrying away the chill of uncertainty. He reflected on the days of hunger and fear, the storm's fury, the wolf's silent challenge, and the triumphant crackle of fire. He acknowledged his small victories, a lean-to against the wind, a snare wrought from vines' symbols carved into trees like guiding stars. But now each felt like threads in a tapestry woven by time. In the tender hush of the evening, Eli found peace. The forest that had tested him now stood at rest, its wild spirit absorbed into the night's calm embrace. He exhaled slowly, letting gratitude fill the spaces fear had once occupied. The crackle of embers softened to a gentle glow, and the weight of the day's lessons settled pleasantly around him. With Bear at his side, Eli closed his eyes, drifting toward dreams of mossy banks and sunlit ridges. The journey's final note was a soft whisper of hope, a promise that no matter how deep the shadows, a warm hearth and gentle companionship awaited at home. And with that comforting thought, he slipped into sleep, safe, sound, and wrapped in the tender glow of belonging.